welcome to The Scriptures Are Real. I'm your host, Lamar Newmeyer, and this is my co-host and also regular host, Kerry Muhlstein.
Hi, Lamar.
Hey, good to see you. It's a brand new year. Happy New Year.
Yeah, thank you. Happy New Year. I'm so excited to be doing Book of Mormon with you this year. It's going to be a great year.
Yes, we've gained a lot of new subscribers, a lot of people listening on different platforms, and thank you for everybody who's listening on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, and of course YouTube. Thank you very much for joining us.
All
the different platforms. We love to hear from you. And if you're new to the podcast, let us give you a little bit of information about it. This is our third year now. We're starting the third year of doing this podcast, right?
Yep.
We started with Old Testament and went through all the Old Testament. Well, I mean, we could have spent much more time on it, but we hit as much as we could. We're kind of going along the Come Follow Me. Our plan is not to rehash the Come Follow Me or go piece by piece, but our objective in this podcast is to take elements of those things that you will see in the Come Follow Me program and talk about how they are real to us, how they're applicable to us now, and to understand that the people and the places that are talked about in these books of Scripture are real places, real people. They dealt with real trouble and joys and happiness as well. So the idea is to make
so it really applies to us, right? That way. So we'll do the deep dives on a few elements rather than cover all of it. We'll take a few real elements and deep dive on it.
Exactly. So that's the goal of this podcast, is to really get into deep in some of the characters and people and how it makes it real to us. So again, thank you for joining us. This whole new year will be the Book of Mormon. And if you haven't heard our other ones, go back and listen. It's not just Kerry and I. Kerry and I talk several different times there throughout the different books, but Kerry has on lots of other guests that he's had that have written books, that have given presentations, are currently studying in Israel, or have great amounts of knowledge in certain areas. And I encourage you to go back and listen to those ones as well. They're very fascinating. I listen to all of them. When I'm not on, I'm listening to what they're recording. So I love all this stuff. I'm a fan of the podcast as well. So, Kerry, anything you want to add as way of intro? Tell me about yourself. You tell us a little bit about where you are from and what how you came to be on this podcast.
Yeah, I guess maybe since we have a lot of listeners that have joined since we began, maybe some people don't know a lot about what you and I do. And I think we did a little intro of you a few episodes ago, but I think we should learn a little bit more, or hopefully we have new people joining as we start Book of Mormon. So I'd love to learn more about you as well, but maybe I can just tell a little bit of my story and why we're doing this podcast. I am a professor of ancient scripture at BYU. I originally thought I was going to be a novelist or a PR person or something along those lines. But I fell in love with the scriptures and helping people really learn and understand the scriptures. And so I was going to be a seminary teacher. Then I saw a teacher. I was taking an Old Testament class, and we had a guest teacher come in, someone who was just finishing a PhD at the University of Chicago. And we were seeing if they wanted to hire this woman. And when I saw what she could do, because she had taken the time to learn a lot about the ancient world, I thought, I don't want to spend the rest of my life wishing that I'd done that. I just need to do that. So I started studying Hebrew and ancient Near Eastern studies. I ended up doing like 7 years of Hebrew and a whole bunch of ancient studies. So I ended up getting a Hebrew minor. Then I did a master's at BYU and basically biblical Hebrew and ancient Near Eastern studies. And in the middle of that, as I was really learning to understand these things, I went to study Hebrew in Jerusalem. And the scriptures became so real to me. And I had some powerful moments where I thought, the Spirit testified, these are real people, real stories. And it was so impactful for me. I thought, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to help others have that experience, whether that be in the classroom or on sites or via podcast, which didn't exist at the time. So I didn't think of that then, but, or whatever, writing or whatever else. I want to help these become real. Part of that, I was figuring out that as these people became real to me, I recognized that for them, a powerful way of communicating was through symbols and symbolic action. that was different than my own culture. But as they became real to me, I realized that's what these people did. And I thought, well, if I'm going to understand the symbols, no one does symbols like ancient Egypt. So I thought I'm going to, study
Oh yeah.
ancient Egypt for a while. And as I did that, I fell in love with ancient Egypt. Just absolutely fell in love with it. Um, I decided I wanted to go and study and become an Egyptologist. But then there were some things happening at BYU, and I decided because I'd also learned to love researching. I got a job as a research assistant, and I fell in love with research. And I thought, well, I need to teach somewhere where I can both teach and research. And if you're going to do that with the scriptures from an LDS point of view, there aren't a lot of options. And
Right.
so I've ended up doing both BYU Hawaii and BYU Provo. Um, but I decided, okay, I'm going to do Egyptology. And then there were some things going on here where there had been some Egyptologists that applied, and then it turns out that they didn't really have a testimony and things. And there was kind of not much of an environment for hiring an Egyptologist. So I thought, well, I'd like to do Egyptology, but I guess I better not if I want this job. And I can still remember I was teaching by that time part-time here at BYU as an adjunct teacher while I was working on some graduate degrees. And I can still remember when an associate dean ran into me right by the elevator. I could go stand in the exact spot still. And he said, are you still interested in studying Egypt? And I said, well, I had been, but you know why I'm not doing it. And he said, well, we just got off the phone. He was, I think I just said he was an associate dean. We just got off the phone with two apostles. I've learned since that was Elder Oaks and Elder Maxwell. But
Wow.
he said, we just got off the phone with two apostles and they'd like for us to study or hire an Egyptologist. So we think that maybe you should go study that. And I can still remember just feeling like I felt like this weight that I didn't even know I was carrying was lifted off my shoulders. I almost felt like I could just feel it going through the ceiling on the third floor of the Joseph Smith building. And I felt like I might float up through that floor, and that was just what I needed to do. So I went and got a degree at my PhD at UCLA in Egyptology with a secondary emphasis in Hebrew language and literature. And I've been pursuing this ever since. I direct an excavation in Egypt. I've taught at the Jerusalem Center a couple of times. I take tours and do studies in Egypt. I've gone there for different studies in Egypt and Israel. I do tours and studies in Israel as well. I've gone there with Egyptologists and Hebraists and archaeologists as we go around different places and try and figure out what's going on. And then I've done it with students. I've done it with family. I've done it with friends. So again, my passion really is, and like I teach at BYU now, and so on. So my passion is to help the scriptures become real to people so they can feel the power that comes when they can apply them in that way.
Well, that is excellent. I didn't know the story about Elder Maxwell and Elder Oaks. That's interesting bit. And I kind of had not the same academic path, but the same path as.
Before you say that, I guess I just want to say something because I
Yeah,
don't
go
want to
ahead.
be misunderstood. I don't know. I'm not trying to say that meant that Elder Maxwell and Elder Oaks had inspiration that I needed to be this person and that they needed to hire me. I'm not implying that.
Right.
Just that their conversation is what prompted that associate dean to talk to me,
Yeah.
but it did change the environment so that they were willing to look into Egyptologists and interested in looking into Egyptologists. So
Yeah. Interesting because, well, that's interesting because I didn't know that we had any real Egyptologists in the church as well. And my story is a little bit similar to yours in the interest wise. I didn't go into the academic side of it like you did, but I did go. I went through. I was always fascinated with Egypt. I just loved anything to do with Egypt. All growing up, just the symbols they had, the writing they had, how they could figure out angles and build these great buildings. I mean, I always had a fascination with that. And on my mission, I had a lot of things. I had a baptism by fire on a lot of things. I got a lot of people. I went on a mission in an area that was very filled with anti-Mormon stuff. And so everyone wanted to test you on this and on that. And I had a good knowledge of this. I had my brother and my dad were very sharp in the gospel and had taught me a lot of stuff. But there was things that were coming up constantly that I couldn't answer. And I'm like, I don't know about that, but I'll look into it and I'll check it out. And, you're trying to teach at the same time you're searching. So I would spend many P days and whatever, going through weird libraries and just studying stuff. And I got to be friends with a pastor on my mission who actually two pastors. One was really good at in Hebrew, and he was teaching me some basics and stuff. And anyway, I got with an institute teacher also who was just fabulous. I've talked about him throughout our time together, Jim Carver. He's passed on, unfortunately, now, but he was a fascinating guy, and he really helped guide me in a lot of things. And if I had a question, I'd say, Brother Carver, what about this? And anyway, it's just fascinating. So when I got off my mission, I really wanted to study a lot of these things and get in deeper into some of them, and including Egypt. And so whatever our audience may not know, some of you may, because we've talked about it before, but we were ward clerks together in a BYU ward, and got to know each other pretty well. And when you first started going into your master's program, I took your first class that you were teaching.
Yeah, you
And
poor soul.
no, it was good. It was a good class. And that's one of the first papers I wrote for your class is I wanted to tie in some stuff. And so with Egypt, and there had been a recent excavation that had turned up some interesting finds. We'll talk about it some other time, but it had some finds that had parallels with the LDS doctrines and gospel and so forth with how we understand things. As I wanted to tie in those findings of the new excavation that had happened that was in the National Geographic, I'm like, oh, this is great. And so I talked to you about it, and you said, you should talk to us, Hugh Nibley. And I'm like, what? Would I ever like to talk to Hugh Nibley? And he had a nice section of the Harold B. Lee Library at the time that was a big section of the library on the fourth floor. And I went over there and made an appointment with him, and he was very gracious and met with me and talked to me. And I also, it helped that I knew his granddaughter Natalie, and I said, hey, I know Natalie too. Anyway, so he walked me around, and he was like a fire hose, like he always is, with just so much information. I was trying to figure out what he was talking about and where he was talking about and how to keep this track. And then I tried to write out as many notes as I could, but he was walking around his library, and he'd grab a book and hand it to me, and he'd pull out of this. And anyway, I just loved Egypt all that time and all this information. And so after I graduated, I went into business and doing all those things. And then you'd gone off to, after I parted, we didn't see each other for a while.
Yeah, I went to UCLA from there, but yeah.
Yeah. And then UCLA, and then you were over there in Jerusalem a few different times. And then
Hawaii.
Exactly. And I saw this video of you talking about one of the things that I had talked about. And I was like, oh, I got to get in touch with him. So anyway, after several years of not contacting, we got in contact again, and I said, hey, can I bug you and ask you about these things? And by that time, you'd finished a PhD in Egyptology, and we're doing an excavation, and I was very excited to do that. Anyway, so that's how I started. But during that time, while you were off, learning all these great things, I'd been a seminary teacher, and I'd continued to study with a bunch of people, and people would ask me questions all the time, like, have you ever heard of this? And have you ever heard of this? And I tried to do the deep research that other people didn't have access to or didn't know existed or whatever. And that's where I came from. And someday I'll tell you, maybe I'll go through about how I worked through some really difficult questions from some anti-Mormons that were just crazy. And anyway, that'll be a fun thing to talk about sometime. Maybe we'll do another one. Anyway,
that seems to me, Lamar, like we should put together a Scriptures Are Real Egypt tour sometime.
Oh yeah.
So, I've got this website I'm starting, Enlighten Edge. What is it? Enlighten Edge EDU, where we're focusing on edifying educational experiences, and I want tours to be part of those experiences. So keep on that website, anyone who's listening, and we'll announce it on here, and it'll have to be a few years because I'm backed up for like about 4 or 5 years on tours, but we'll put together a Scriptures Are Real podcast tour.
I'll be the first one to sign up on that.
Yeah. Well, you and I'll host it. It'll be fun.
That'd be great. And I know that you've done some great work with this year, or end of last year, with Saints Unscripted, and a few other people that are putting together good stuff. And I'd like to do that too. I'd like to draw in a good or contribute to your efforts to drawing in other people that are working hard to bring to light the dark things of the world. Not dark things of the world, but that's how the scriptures read it.
Yeah.
But things that we don't know much about, or anyway, connecting the dots for people so that they can understand there are resources and there are people out there that can help you answer questions. It's easier to access people now, and so let's access that information and get that out to people. So anyway, that's where Kerry and I come from, and a couple of years ago, Kerry said, "Hey, do you want to co-host a podcast with me?" And I'm like, "For sure." I mean, I'm not near the researcher that you have been, or got the degrees that you do, but I am an enthusiast in this, and I do love the scriptures. So I'll be happy to contribute where I can. So that's how we came together doing this podcast, and we hope it's something that you can get into, that you can be excited about, that it makes the scriptures come alive and are real to you. And we're excited for this book of scripture. And I wanted to talk a
Yes.
little bit about this, just the name. First of all, the Book of Mormon. Sometimes that comes off so casually, the Book of Mormon. The book. I like to think of it as the record of Mormon. It's not a book that Mormon wrote about stuff. He abridged a record of a people. This is a collection of journals and passages and wisdom that he has, and he's collected that together and abridged it for us. But it's a record of the people of Mormon, or where he comes from. And
Yeah.
I like to think of it as a record or a journal rather than just a book. It's not just a book. The Bible's not just a book. This is a record of people. This is what they wrote down. This is their life story. This is their legacy that they left for us. And Mormon has come along and selected out the parts that are going that he feels inspired, that are going to be the best for us. He and some other prophets also have abridged some things along with Moroni at the end, but have picked out these parts that will be specifically for our generation, things that will resonate with our generation, because he knows what we're going to go through. He's seen our day, and he's like, these things will be relevant to you. So it's if someone's combing through 1,000 years of history roughly and saying, here's the things that happened to us, you should pay attention to these things.
Yeah, you're so right, and I hope we can think about, as you said, each of these individuals will be studying and make them real for us. Like really think about who they are, what they're going through as they do this, and I think you're right that the key to really understanding that. Now, the small plates that we're starting with weren't from Mormon, other than that he saw them and he was like, these are fantastic, and I'm inspired to include them. But most of what we're going to read, uh, we have to always keep in mind Mormon, or for a little bit Moroni's role, right? And you touched on this, but Moroni says, "I speak to you as if you were present. You're not, but I've seen you. All right, I know your doings." And you have to assume that was true for Mormon as well. I don't know why
Right.
God would
I'm
do it
sure.
just for Moroni and say, "Well, I know you're only doing a little bit of this, but let's help you really understand." Your dad didn't need to understand, right? I'm sure it's true of Mormon as well. So let's be thinking of the people Mormon is giving us the record of all along, but let's also think of Mormon as a real. I hope he becomes very real to us. Mormon should become our guide and our friend this year as we think about, okay, Mormon, why are you giving me this? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What's been going on with you? What inspiration are you receiving that guides you to include this? Now, for this first part, that's going to be Nephi, right?
Right.
What's
Right.
and we're going to have to ask those questions about Nephi.
Nephi's going to narrate his own thing, but you're right. As soon as we get to the transitions here between the books, you'll see Mormon pop in and like, I'm going to add a little section here and bridge this to this, and thus we see that a
Yeah.
lot from Mormon, and thus we see this is what happened, and then he'll bridge another part. So we'll see those editorial notes as he goes along and those narratives. So yes, he really did, cull through a lot of things to get what he is, and exactly like Mormon. I think Moroni is just an extension of Mormon. He's really just fulfilling the end of what his father saw and
Yeah.
did, and he puts that. So let's
Well, and maybe let's talk about
yeah.
Nephi as we're starting here,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I don't think we'll end up spending a great deal of time on it when we get there. But if we were to go to First Nephi 19, which is outside of this week's reading, but I think it's in next week's reading. If not, it's soon thereafter. But um, you, Nephi lets us know I've already written this, right? I've already written a whole story. I've written plates and I'm inspired to write this now, these small plates. And that's what we're going to get. We're not going to get Nephi's other writings. We're getting these small plates. And it's probably hard. Like for me, it's difficult to do another writing of something. You're like, I already wrote this. I don't have the energy to write this again.
Right.
But Nephi really gets into this. And we're going to have to ask ourselves, why is Nephi including what he's including and the way he's including it, the way he's summarizing it, what is he skipping over? What is he focusing on? Because there's tons of stuff he skips over and a ton of stuff he really, really focuses on. And
Right.
we need to let Nephi be real to us and then ask ourselves, why is the Lord inspiring Nephi and what's going on with Nephi that this is what he's giving us?
Right. That's great. And the task of these guys to break all this history down into this, just the most plain and precious parts, if I put it that way. There's a lot of other things that are happening. I'm sure there's a lot of other
Yeah.
records and things that they can't include here. And just to set the stage, and most of our readers or not readers, but listeners and watchers will know this. The Book of Mormon is particularly about 4 sets of people. Now there are subgroups in there, and then there's different kind of ites, the Zoramites or whatever like that. But it's particularly about Lehi and his family, who then split into Lamanites and Nephites and Lamanites. And then there's some subgroups, Zoramites and so forth. But that's that one family that goes throughout the whole Book of Mormon. Within that group, we intersect 2 other groups that came to this continent independent of Lehi and his family. We have the Mulekites, and we'll talk about them. We won't get into it here, but we'll talk about the Mulekites came independently from the Jerusalem area, as did the Jaredites much before them. The Jaredites are way back Tower of Babel time, so we're talking Genesis era.
Yeah.
They came over here and were here, and so there's a lot of things going on in this, and we'll hit a lot of those different books, but that's the main stage that we're looking at, is this one family and where they go, and then of course we'll intersect with some histories of 2 other people over here. But how many other books or sets of scripture are there out there? Are there other islands of the sea or other continents to where people went and had prophets and had writings that we just don't have? Part of the 10 tribes, is there something in Scandinavia? We don't know.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sure there are more, and I think you're right. It's important to recognize that we're getting this from Nephi's descendants, right? So in a way, sometimes we forget this, but the Book of Mormon actually helps us remember it. That the Bible is the record of Judah's descendants, especially the Old Testament, right, but still really most of the New Testament. It's the record of Judah's descendants, and we know that they didn't include a lot of stuff that came from that northern group. And the reason we know that is because they're in the Book of Mormon, right?
That's
so,
right.
So we know that there's a lot of stuff in there, but and we sometimes forget how influenced what we're being presented with is by whose point of view we're getting it. So we're getting this from the Nephites. Now, that it also reminds me of something else that's worth just touching on. We don't know enough to say much more, but there are plenty of scholars, and a rather convincing article, but plenty of scholars, and I'm fairly convinced of this myself, who would argue that as the Lehi's family gets here, we tend to think, okay, they got here, the Jaredites had all died, and so it's a big empty land, and there's no one else. And I suspect that's not accurate. I suspect that there are a bunch of people running around, and that when the Lamanites are defecting, as it were, that in some ways they're joining other people, and the Nephites just call all those people Lamanites or whatever.
Sure.
I mean, the Lamanites, how else would they be so much more numerous than the Nephites, especially after the Nephites have joined the Mulekites? You'd expect them to be more, now that you have 2 groups that are joined together, and yet there are still more Lamanites than there are Nephites, right? Or you have little things like when you have, now I can't think of his name. What's our first Antichrist? Sherem comes to Jacob, right? And he says, I've been trying to find a way to talk to you for a long time. Well, if the only people around are Lehi's family, that's Uncle Jacob, right? How hard is it to go find your uncle? There are like 5 families around. I mean, it's not that hard to go find him, right? But he's been having a hard time finding him and talking to him, which suggests he's an outsider, and so on. So anyway, I don't know that we know for sure, but it's worth being open to that idea that there may be a number of people who kind of get glossed over because the descendants of Nephi are focusing on Lehi's family.
Well, and we know that the reason why we know this is because these people, Mulekites and the Jaredites, wrote stuff down. We have some writings from them, and which we're going to get to here in chapter 1, which is a key to why they needed the plates of Laban, or the plates that Laban had, those brass plates. Otherwise, their language and their record might be lost forever. So we're going to get that in just a second. But you're right. There's probably other people that were here or around, or that they intersected with, but we don't have a record of, because there was no written language, or there wasn't any written record, rather, of these people and what they did. But you're right. They probably were here, and there might be other stories out there that we just don't know of right now. So
yeah.
Well, that's fun. Okay. By the way, one more thing by setup. I'm going to try to remember to put these and give you the show notes. There are two things that help in the seminary. You would get those little cards, and they at the beginning they would have some sort of summaries. And there's a chronology chart that might help some people. It looks kind of busy, and you have to spend some time with it to look and figure out what's actually going. But there's a lot of information on that card. It's not as easy to find as you might think, but it's online. You can get to it, and it has a record of these people and where they went and the little notes about them. We'll put that in the show notes. There's a Book of Mormon timeline, and there's also a chronology chart that is online in the study helps, and we'll put that one there too.
It'll that the church produced, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it's in the study helps, and it will tell you the groups of people and their rough timeline where it happened. So that might be, if you're new to the Book of Mormon or you're just remembering how it all goes together, it's been a little while since we've gone over it. That might help you just kind of put some things in order, who is what, and make it a little more clear, and then you can start filling it in with the characters. So with saying that, let's get in there. And I have a question for you.
Yeah.
We start off with the book of Nephi. Now we have First Nephi and Second Nephi. Why do we break it up into two books? Now remember, originally when Joseph Smith translated this, and the first printings of the Book of Mormon don't have all the headings. It's just a straight narrative all the way through. It doesn't have verses 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. We do that later just for ease. Same with the Bible. We do that just for ease of breaking up to where we can reference different parts. But originally it was there. But why do we have two books of Nephi instead of just one book?
Yeah, there are some headings that seem to be inherent to the gold plates. So not the stuff that's in italics that we've created, right? Where, for example, if you're to go to First Nephi chapter 1, underneath the chapter 1 heading, you see in italics, Nephi begins the record of his people and so on. But the stuff right above that seems to be either, well, you see at the very end of it, it's talking third person for most of it. Nephi taketh his brethren and returns to the land of Jerusalem and so on. But at the very end of that, you get this line, this is according to the account of Nephi, or in other words, I, Nephi, wrote this record, right? And so you get a little bit of that if you go to Second Nephi, right before where it says chapter 1 and has the italics, and that's the stuff that we've added. And I just have to tell you, and maybe I'm a heretic for this, but I'm not a huge fan of those chapter summaries. They can be useful. So I find them really useful if you're trying to find something quickly.
Right.
But if people read them ahead of time, then basically, typically what happens is people limit themselves. They say, oh, this is what it's about, and they don't find any other meaning. They've just had someone else tell them what they can find in that chapter, what they will learn from that chapter, and they don't open themselves up to the Spirit teaching them something different, or their mind being able to teach them something different. They've said, okay, whoever wrote this chapter heading, and the people who wrote those said again and again, this isn't comprehensive, this isn't necessarily inspired, this isn't the Scripture. So I always skip the chapter headings. Plus, who wants to read the end of the book at the beginning? But anyway, but I don't skip this stuff that's before it because it seems to be written by Nephi. So you get part of the reason we break it into Second Nephi is that you get here at the right before where we write chapter 1, he says, an account of the death of Lehi. Nephi's brethren rebel against him. The Lord wants Nephi to depart into the wilderness, his journeyings in the wilderness, and so forth. So Nephi seems to have inserted a break there, and that's why we do. Now, the break seems to be we've gotten to the promised land. They get to the promised land, and then there are some things that prophetically and theologically he's going to say about that, because they get there in First Nephi 18 and then 19 through the end of First Nephi. He's going to talk to us about through chapter 22. He's going to talk to us about how they've been broken off from Israel. And so we'll talk about this more when we get there. But this is a big thing for them. The covenant's about the promised land. We're not in the promised land anymore. We're in a different promised land. What does that mean for us? And so they've got this whole thing where they try and understand what it means for them to be Israelites or part of the house of Israel or covenant people in a different place. And as soon as he's done with that, then he says a break and he says, okay, well, now this is the record of what it's like for us in the promised land. And that seems to be the real division between First and Second Nephi, even though there's not a lot of story in Second Nephi. It's mostly talking about Christ.
Yeah, I have a way of thinking about that. no, first of all, I guess we should say that the Book of Mormon, or the plates that the Book of Mormon was translated from, would have started with the Book of Lehi. There was a Book
Yeah.
of Lehi who started with that, and there's much information in there where he talks about, where he would have talked about his vision and all those kind of things. But because
Yeah,
of the
and presumably
116,
Lehi's other right, or Nephi's other right, Mormon abridging the large plates of Nephi presumably is on there as well, right? So you've got Lehi's and Nephi's writings, presumably.
right, exactly. And so you're going to have quite a bit of information, and that's lost to us now. We don't know how big the Book of Lehi was. We know there was 116 handwritten pages that came from that, but we don't know if that was the whole Book of Lehi,
Yeah.
or if it might have been part of it and they stopped it. But Nephi says, my dad did this. He wrote all that stuff down. I'm not going to cover all this. You'll see that in the first 3 chapters. There's a couple things he'll say. My dad had these great visions and many things he saw. I'm not going to write those things. He did. He already wrote those things. But he does say later, the Lord wanted me to do a recap for whatever purpose, for a wise purpose, he calls it. He's going to do a recap and do this. Well, we know what the wise purpose was, because the Book of Lehi ends up effectually lost for us. We don't have the Book of Lehi. So Nephi comes, recounts some of that same type of thing. So I think of the first part of Nephi, first Nephi, I think of it as mostly the narrative of his people. There's a little bit of that in second Nephi, but the second Nephi, the second book of Nephi, I think is the lecture series.
Yeah.
I think he does try to, because then he goes, we see this and this happens, and then also this reminds us of Isaiah, and then he quotes a bunch of Isaiah. So that's the lecture series. And then Jacob pops up in there a little bit, finishes off a couple of things, So I think of that as the lecture series and the wrap up of some other things. But most of the first of Nephi is the history part that he recaps again, includes his father's writings and vision and so forth. Second Nephi is a little bit of narrative, but a lot of lectures. And I don't make that sounds too boring. Maybe general conference talks or whatever, or he's teaching the
fantastic
people.
sermons. Yeah.
Sermons is a better way to say it. Yeah, sermons is better because he talks about that and he expounds on the words of Isaiah. And sometimes he just copies straight sections of Isaiah, in there, and like, hey, this is what Isaiah said, and these are great, right? So I just wanted to kind of get that out there. There's 2 books, and why the books, they kind of overlap each other, sort of, but there's a reason why there's 2 separate books there. And, they kind of, they kind of go back. So anyway, so let's get into First Nephi. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. So we learned a little bit about Nephi, and of course, in the first 2 chapters, especially, you're going to get a lot of the primary things one of the things like born of goodly parents, and then I will go and do all the things that you hear in primary about Nephi. You'll see those pop up at the beginning here. And I like the way Nephi introduces himself in there. He's born of goodly parents. He's taught somewhat in learning his father, and he has seen many afflictions in his days. So this is obviously written as a summary. He's at the end of his life, I would imagine. At this point,
this seems to be the end of his ministry.
Exactly.
And again, it's worth thinking. I was going to say this earlier and I forgot. It's worth thinking that, again, these are the small plates of Nephi, right? So Mormon appends them to this. They're not integral to the Book of Mormon in some ways, right? To what he's written, they're something he just Mormon appends on because he's inspired to do so. And now we know, well, that good. We need this. It's just incredible information, but it also saves us from the last 116 pages. It's also worth thinking that we're pretty sure, we don't know 100% for sure, but pretty sure that when Joseph Smith is translating, he just keeps translating where he was when he lost the plates. And then he eventually gets back to these small plates. So these are probably actually the last things.
Say a little bit about the big and the small plates, just to be clear. We're not talking about the first and second book of Nephi. We're talking about different sets. So say a little bit about that.
First and second Nephi and Jacob and Jerem and Enos, Jerem, all this up through the words of Mormon are these small plates that were the second set of plates that Nephi wrote. So you've got the large plates of Nephi and the small plates of Nephi. I always laugh when he gets to explain the difference. He says, I've got these large plates, which I call the plates of Nephi. And then I made these small plates, which I call the plates of Nephi. I'm like, that's so helpful. But Mormon seems to be abridging from the kind of more historical records, which I would guess the large plates of Nephi fit into. And this is that religious record. And he just finds it kind of when he's done, almost done with it. And he just sticks it on there. So they seem to be smaller than the other stuff. I'm guessing physically. Maybe it means lengthwise. I don't know. So this is really a different genre than the rest of the Book of Mormon, which is all Mormon's abridgment or Moroni's abridgment. This is just pure, straight Nephi, not abridging anything, just preaching his heart out.
Great. All right. So I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but sometimes people get they think of first and second Nephi. I don't know how many people, but I would get this in seminary occasionally. Are we talking about first and second Nephi, the big and small plates? No. We're talking about the source material that Mormon abridged from.
Yeah.
Are from the small plates and big plates. Some of them.
Well, but the small plates are not an abridgment, right? They're just pure actual Nephi.
Yeah. Right. And then the large plates are the more record of the people, but maybe it's maybe Nephi thinks of them as his kernels of wisdom, his Psalms or whatever, something like that.
It's kind of his preaching magnum opus almost, right?
Yeah.
This is it's a little bit like I'm just right now reading. Actually, I'm listening to The Heart of the Matter, right? Which is President Nelson taking a lot of his different talks that he's already given and putting them together in a coherent way. And it seems like he's trying to say, here are the things I'm really trying to get you all to get. I think I've got a sense that that's what Nephi's doing. This is Nephi at the end of a long ministry since he was young, right? And now he's old. He's saying, here, let me put it all together in a way that gives you the most important stuff so you get what you really need to get.
Okay, that's excellent. Good. All right, so that's where we start off, and we get a good idea of who Nephi is. And we know he's born of goodly parents. He's taught the language of his father. And then he says in verse 2, which when he's writing is a connection with the Jews, or is in the language of the Jews, but he also says the Egyptians. Now, you're an Egyptologist, so tell us why that's important to us.
Yeah, and I'll talk about it just a little bit, and then I'll refer you. We've got this whole hour with Noel Reynolds where we jump into that a bit more. Good. And I'm not sure he and I see exactly the same thing there, but so I suspect when he says the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians, there are a couple of ways you can take this. You can take this as in, I'm writing the way that I culturally have learned to write, but I'm doing it with the Egyptian language and script. Or a number of people take it, and I lean slightly towards this, but we really don't have good evidence one way or the other, that it's Hebrew language and Egyptian script.
Okay.
And so you're writing actual Hebrew words, but you're using Egyptian script because Egyptian you can get 3 or 4 or 5 consonants in one, and it's really common to have 3 consonants in one sign, right? So you can reduce the record by, make it only a third, take up a third as much space by using that kind of script than if you're using an alphabetic script, which is what Hebrew is. So they can make it's easier to write in metal. It's going to take up, so you have to make fewer metal plates. You have to do less scratching into metal and everything if you're using that script. So I'm sure it's at least the Egyptian script. Maybe it's also Egyptian language, and maybe it is Hebrew in Egyptian. And we see some examples of that around Lehi's time where they're using some Egyptian script to convey some Hebrew ideas and so on. So that kind of thing happens.
So like one little symbol could be several of our English words, or even maybe a whole concept or sentence could be in our English script. Just one little symbol.
I mean, probably not a whole sentence, but you can certainly get at least a word.
Well, maybe a sentence, a phrase, maybe.
Yeah. A word or a phrase.
Well, like we were talking about, and it came to pass could be one little particular symbol, and there's a lot of it came to passes. So if you took all those came to pass and put them into one little symbol, then you could say, well, now there's a space of time happens from here to here, and it came to pass. So that's one little symbol. I mean, we don't know what it looks like exactly, but that's kind of what I'm interpreting. So you have a word or a phrase could be several different words. So we can, like you said, could reduce it by a third or more, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, not by like 2/3, so that it's only a third as long. Right?
Yeah. Oh, it's only a third as long. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, that's important. He gives us a couple of clues there. That's already in chapter 1, verse 2, and he talks about how he's writing. So And you talk about a little bit in your in the book of Abraham, your book about the book of Abraham. You talk a little bit about that too. So I would refer our audience to Kerry's book on that. He talks about how the Egyptians write and some of the prophecies that we have in book of Abraham. Anyway, all right.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too far on that. Okay, so this is happening about they leave Jerusalem right about the time of Zedekiah is
Yeah.
starting his reign. So it's 600-ish BC, right?
Yeah. And a really, really crucial time. So, in fact, I'll try and
Yeah, tell
drop
us
this
what's going
reference.
on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll do it just a teeny bit. I'll drop a reference in the show notes to a book that's called Glimpses of Lehi's Jerusalem, where you have scores of, well, a whole bunch of articles just going through all the different political and cultural things going on at that time period. It's a really crucial time period for both the Bible and the Book of Mormon. And I'll touch on it maybe just a little here, but I've thought about this a lot. And I could do a 2 or 3 hour lecture just on the historical and political things going on there. And instead, what I think I'll do, I am in the midst of creating a website where I can just put extra stuff. And I'll throw that on there as the extra stuff, rather than going through right now an hour and a half of the political things, because I don't know that that's what everyone wants. But for those who want that, we'll get. So we're doing the deep dives here in Scriptures Are Real, and then I'll have the deeper of the deep dives that I'll throw out there for people that are interested in that. But just basically, you have right at this time period real conflict in Jerusalem behind whether they should rebel against Babylon or just submit to Babylon. And Jeremiah is telling them submit, and people don't like that. And Zedekiah keeps going back and forth and back and forth, and he waffles all over the place because of all the huge political pressure being put upon him, and there's a lot at stake. And so Jeremiah has become deeply unpopular by a huge segment of the population, because he's saying, if you rebel against Babylon, you'll be destroyed. And those who want to rebel against Babylon find that to be not helpful for their cause. And so he's imprisoned, and you see them talking about him casting, and Nephi talks about them casting Jeremiah into prison. All sorts of terrible things happen to Jeremiah because of this. And there are other prophets that are doing this. Ezekiel's alive at this time, and there are other prophets, and Lehi is one of those. And so Lehi is also going to fit into this group that a large part of the population will say, and especially a lot of powerful people in the military. So consider yourself, you're a military commander, and you're trying to get your men ready to fight against Babylon. And they're hearing prophets saying, if you fight against Babylon, you'll be destroyed. Right? How helpful is that for the military commander? Right? Now, the problem is that they are not listening to the Lord. What they should do is say, right. That's what God is saying, so let's adjust accordingly. But instead they say, well, this is what we're doing, so I don't like what God is saying, right? But right. It becomes easier to say, I don't like what the prophet is saying. And you just say that prophet, what that man is saying. So you can start distancing yourself from God so that you can hold to your own beliefs rather than listen to what God says. And we do that today, plenty.
Yeah. Relying on the arm of flesh, right? So
yep.
Yeah, what should we be doing? Why did the family proclamation come out, 20 years ago or so? And all the other things that the prophets have been saying all this time, they've been saying this whole thing, but we're like, nah, we're going to go ahead and be strong and conquer with tanks and planes and things.
Yeah.
So but that's not going to conquer the people's hearts. So exactly. So we have Babylon on the borders. They haven't overtaken Jerusalem yet.
Well, I mean, they have, they've taken some people off, right? They've conquered them once. Yeah.
Right. Series of
they've
attacks.
conquered them. Yeah. And taken some people off, and they've, at this point, they have submitted to Babylon, but they're thinking of rebelling against Babylon again. And
right. Yeah.
That's where Lehi and Jeremiah are. They're warning them of their wickedness. And this is a really important thing. So again, I'll get more into this in the other kind of deep dive thing on it's going to be Enlighten Edge EDU, but is the site I'm trying to set up. But there, in essence, you've got a group of people who want to say, nope, we can rebel against Babylon because God always protects us. And you've got Jeremiah and Lehi who are saying, God's not going to protect you. You're not keeping the covenant. Right. And they don't want to hear that at all, right? No, don't tell us that. So that's why they want to kill Lehi. He is a political threat. And Laman and Lemuel fit in with this other group. right? They're going to say, no, the great city Jerusalem can't be destroyed. We've seen God save it before, or our ancestors did, right? So it can't be destroyed. And kind of forgetting, well, yeah, that was when Hezekiah got everyone to really renew the covenant and keep the covenant. There's something about that whole covenant business you're forgetting, right?
Yeah, this is very much an Old Testament narrative, like we saw many times when we cover the Old Testament. The people are constantly fighting against themselves. They incorporate the cultures around them, and they forget the covenant. They're not keeping the commandments and things they should be doing, and then they come back and there's a revival a little bit, then they lose it. So this is straight out of that same time period, and Lehi is one of those prophets. And I think we even mentioned him when we did the Old Testament. I think you mentioned this is Lehi is one of these guys saying these things. It's one of these, not guys, but one of these prophets that is saying these things.
Yeah. In fact, if it's all right, maybe
Yeah.
that's what we can do for the rest of our time is just do a little teeny bit of a deep dive. Not that we won't. I mean, I could go forever on this, but
Yeah.
a little bit of a deep dive on this covenant theme that I think we're going to see here, because I think we're going to see it play out for the rest of the Book of Mormon. And so we're even going to see this being touched on in Lehi's dream and Nephi's vision and so on, and then how they bring it back in on the doctrine of Christ and so on, or what Jacob and Nephi and Isaiah are doing in the second Nephi, right? We're going to see these same things going again and again and again. So there's some interesting things I think are worth looking at. So we get picking up right where we were, right? We've got the prophets coming in verse 4. And because Lehi hears those prophets and saying they have to repent or they'll be destroyed, Lehi in verse 5, he prays, right, with all his heart. And look at what he's praying for in behalf of his people. I mean, again, this is what it's really all about. He has this visionary experience in his prophetic calling because he's praying for others, not because he's praying for himself to draw closer to God, but because he's praying for others. And as he prays, and this is one of the things that I find so striking as we look at Lehi's experience here, it fits in so well with patterns we see in the Old Testament of prophetic calls, right? So he sees fire comes, so light or fire is so often part of this. The fire comes and he hears much, and it scares him, right? He's quaking and trembling exceedingly because of what he hears. And he goes to his house and he casts himself on his bed, and then he has like a vision or a dream, right? That we get in verse 8. And he sees God and the angels around God, and one descending out of the midst of heaven that's above the luster of the sun of noonday, and 12 following him. So this has to be a savior figure, right? I think this is Christ. But what's really interesting is that verse 11, and this is, I mean, everything we're reading here is so similar, say, to what Ezekiel sees. And we get little touches of it in Isaiah 6 and so on. But the beginning of Ezekiel, and we see this kind of thing all over the scriptures, similar thing, where the first one comes and stands before Lehi in verse 11 and gave unto him a book and bid him that he should read. So this is so often they're given a book. It's really a scroll, is how we should translate it, I think.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And that's what their message is. That's what their task is, right? And he's filled with the Spirit of the Lord. Now, I find this so interesting. First of all, he's going to say, "Woe unto Jerusalem! He's seen their abominations." And then this is where we get, my father recorded a lot of things about Jerusalem and how it would be destroyed and many would perish by the sword and so on. But Nephi's not going to write it down. But look, so that's bad stuff he's seen, right? Abominations, destruction, sword, being carried away captive. And then verse 14, and it came to pass that when my father had read and seen many great and marvelous things, he did exclaim many things unto the Lord, such as, "Great and marvelous are thy works, O Lord God Almighty. Thy throne is high in the heavens, and thy power and goodness and mercy are over all the inhabitants of the earth. And because thou art merciful, thou wilt not suffer that those who come unto thee shall perish." That's not what you'd expect someone to say when they just saw abominations and destruction and sword and captivity, right?
Right.
But this is, I think this is evidence that Lehi is understanding the covenant, because what God does in the covenant is if you stop keeping the covenant, he humbles you so that you'll come back to him and keep the covenant again. And he'll protect those who are keeping the covenant. Now, that doesn't mean that no bad things will happen to them or that they won't get carried away captive to Babylon, but they'll have some kind of protection, right? So like Lehi feels like he's being protected, and he is. that doesn't mean bad stuff won't happen to him. Lots of bad stuff happens to him. And what he's asked to do is hard. But in the end, he sees that this is God really taking care of him. He's thinking celestial, we could say, right? He's
Right.
seeing where this goes. And so he's in the midst of seeing the tough stuff, he recognizes that all of that is designed to bring about that which is for our good. And so he says, God, you are merciful. And your power and your mercy are so great that we won't perish because we come to you. And that's just an incredible view that we struggle with as we go through the difficult things. And we need to learn a lesson from Lehi here, right? So if we keep going, we get again Nephi saying, I'm not going to write everything my father did, but
He said things, visions and dreams. He also had written many things which he prophesied and spake to children. So imagine that book of Lehi has some good things in it.
Yeah. I wish we had that, right?
Yeah.
I wish we had it. And then they at the end of that chapter, they want to kill Lehi because of what he's done. And then Lehi has a dream again at the beginning of chapter 2, where he's told that he needs to leave. Now, this is a really interesting thing. We talk about the scattering of Israel, right? And we had it with the 10 tribes with Assyria, and we're right in the midst of it with and it's, I mean, when we simplify when we say 10 tribes and 12 tribes, because as will be very apparent here in the Book of Mormon, there are people from every tribe that are in Jerusalem. So we know that, like, there are more people. We just know from history and archaeology that there are more people in Jerusalem that aren't of Judah than are of Judah at this time. So there are people from every tribe, tons of them, right? But in any case, we're going to see the scattering of these tribes that are in the southern kingdom. That's starting to happen right now as well. And all of it has been because they've been wicked, except for Lehi. This is a scattering that happens because he's righteous.
Yeah.
And God is going to take him and his family away to spare him the destruction because he is righteous, but it's still part of the scattering. This is how Israel goes all throughout the world, right? So he's told that he needs to go into the wilderness, and that this will be a blessing to him, and they'll avoid all this terrible stuff. So he leaves everything and he builds an altar. I love that. We see, just like Abraham, wherever they go, they're building altars and giving thanks. They're offering sacrifices and giving thanks and so on. And he's giving great lessons to Laman and Lemuel and so on, that we could just get into all of that a bunch. But I want to focus on one particular thing. We get in verse 16 of 1 Nephi 2. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, being exceedingly young, nevertheless being large in stature, don't know why we care about that, but anyway, and also we care about it later because he can tackle Zoram.
Yeah.
Having great desires to know of the mysteries of God, wherefore I did cry unto the Lord, and behold, he did visit me and did soften my heart, that I did believe all the words which had been spoken by my father. Wherefore I did not rebel against him like my brothers. And he tells that to Sam, and so on. But here's where we get some really crucial stuff, starting in verse 9. And it came to pass that the Lord spake unto me, saying,
verse 19.
All right, thank you. Verse 19. And it came to pass that the Lord spake unto me, saying, Blessed art thou, Nephi, because of thy faith, for thou hast sought me diligently with lowliness of heart. Now, we're going to come back to what the message is in a second, but I want to kind of look at the meta message here, the how he gets the message. First of all, he's crying to the Lord. He's asking God to, okay, my father's learning things I want to know too. So he's asking, and he's told, it's because you sought me diligently. But how? He sought him with faith, believing he'd really learn, and with lowliness of heart, recognizing he needs this, right? And then the Spirit softens him so that he believes this. And he's going to learn some pretty cool stuff we're going to come back to in just a second. But I find it really interesting that he says in the end that this is stuff that the Lord spake unto him through his Spirit, which makes me think that he's had a prompting the same way you and I have promptings.
Yeah.
Right. But anyway, what I want to focus on is this, the promise that he's given when the Lord speaks to him, starting in verse 20. All right. And what I'd like to do, and I actually wrote an article on this that I'll also drop in the show notes. It's called Prospering in the Land. comparing prophecies between, I don't remember the subtitle, but anyway, comparing prophecies between the Bible and the Book of Mormon or something like that. It's published at the Interpreter Foundation. But I'm going to kind of walk us through a comparison. The place where you have the Abrahamic covenant most fully explicated is probably Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. So we're going to look at the Leviticus 26 version of that covenant and compare it to these very small verses. So it's a whole chapter compared to just like a couple verses in First Nephi chapter 2. So in Leviticus 26, in verse 3, you get the beginning of the covenant. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, all right? So that's the if, right? The comparison to that is in First Nephi 2:20, where it says, and inasmuch as you shall keep my commandments, right?
Right.
Then, if you keep going, verses 4 through 5 and 9 through 10 of Leviticus 26, you get, then I will give you rain in its due season, and your land will increase and bear fruit, and you'll have lots of bread, and you'll be fruitful and multiply, and you'll have lots to eat. You won't have to eat old stuff because you keep having new stuff and so on. That shows up in First Nephi 2:20 just as ye shall prosper, right? So you had like 10 verses in Leviticus saying, if you keep my commandments, then you'll prosper. And you have part of one verse in First Nephi 2:20 that says, inasmuch as you keep my commandments, you'll prosper. But it's the same covenant, all right? We get also, say, in verses 5 through 6, it talks of Leviticus, it talks about having a land to dwell in. And then in 6 through 8, it talks about being protected in that land. And we get, again, in First Nephi 2:20, you'll be led out to a land of promise and a land that I've prepared for you that's choice above other lands. And then as we get into verses 22 and 23, and inasmuch you keep my commandments, you'll be a ruler, and those who fight against you will be cursed, basically. So it's the same thing that we have in Leviticus. We get in Leviticus 26:11 through 12, he talks about having the tabernacle where they can experience God's presence. God will walk among them and be their God. And we get in First Nephi 2:21 that when Nephi's brethren rebel, then they'll be cut off from God. And that's implying that Nephi and his people won't be cut off from God. So in other words, they'll have his presence, right?
Right.
In say Leviticus 26:14 through 17, he talks about the judgments that will come when they don't obey the commandments or don't keep the covenant. And in First Nephi 2:24, we get, and if it so be that they, meaning Nephi's seed, rebel against me, then they, Laman's seed, will be a scourge unto thy seed, right? They'll be punished when they don't keep the covenant.
Right.
Then we get Leviticus 26:41 through 42. It talks about when they will remember the covenant with Jacob, then God will remember them and they'll have all the blessings. And we get in First Nephi 2:24, they, meaning the Lamanites, will be a scourge unto thy seed to stir them up in the ways of remembrance, right? And then they can receive those covenant blessings. So
if they remember that, they'll be reclaimed.
Yeah. And that's maybe kind of a long and boring way to go through, this article goes through it in more detail, but I just want people to see how point by point the covenant is established or reestablished in a way with Nephi and his people, that God is assuring them as they're leaving the promised land, which they associate with, if we're part of the covenant people, we're in the promised land. He is telling them, you are still part of the covenant people. There's another promised land. This covenant is specifically with you. Now it's with all the other descendants of Abraham as well, but specifically with you as you go, this covenant is applicable. And we find that in the title page, and if we look for it, we're going to find it all throughout the Book of Mormon, this notion that the covenant was made with them and they need to keep it. So we've learned some phrases that help us recognize it in the Bible, but in the Book of Mormon, the most common phrase is going to be something like prospering in the land, or inasmuch as you keep my commandments. Those are the phrases that our listeners need to listen to or recognize as they're going throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon to say, talking about the covenant. Now, all the other phrases in the Bible as well, like, you have more innumerable seed, or God is protecting you, or whatever else. But those are specific Book of Mormon phrases to clue us in that it's talking about the covenant. And if we'll start looking for it now, we're going to and we're going to try and guide you throughout the rest of the year in finding some of these things. But if you start looking for it now, you're going to find so many more references to the covenant in the Book of Mormon than you had thought there were. And President Nelson has encouraged us to find those references and list the blessings that come and so on, right? So I hope that we can be helpful for that.
Yeah, I mean, and again, why is this in here? Because the same thing applies to us. The same thing that applied in Leviticus applied to the people of Lehi. The same thing applies to us. If you are abiding by the covenant, you're preserved and you will not perish, and
Yeah.
you'll prosper. Now, doesn't it's not always milk and honey, but other times you have, but you won't perish. The Lord will watch out for it. We're going to see that over and over in the Book of Mormon. That we often call it the pride cycle. It's very clear in the Book of Mormon the time periods, but it applies that we're going to see it directly relate to our day as well.
Yeah, and that's one thing that again, and maybe we finish off with this. I don't know if you have other stuff you want to talk about, but I would encourage us. The pride cycle is a great way of looking at this, and pride is certainly an important major theme in the Book of Mormon. But I would say another way we can look at this is the covenant corruption cycle. Because the pride cycle we see, say, in the Old Testament, and we might call it the idolatry cycle there or something, but we see it all over the place. And it's a different false god, might be pride, many changes of apparel, one in the Book of Mormon, right? Something like that.
Right.
But what it is we receive the blessings that come from keeping the covenant, and then we think that we've gotten them because we're great, or because our armies are powerful, or because false gods have given them to us, or whatever it is. But we think that the blessings have come from something other than from God, and so we turn away from God. So then God humbles us so that we'll remember him and keep our covenants again. And you can call that the pride cycle. You can call it all sorts of other things. And we should note the element or the place that pride plays in it. But I think we also are coming to understand that we need to recognize the importance of covenant. And so let's recognize the role that covenant plays in this cycle that we'll see throughout the Book of Mormon as well. So I think having that in mind here at the beginning of our study of the Book of Mormon will also help us understand the Book of Mormon better.
I think that's great. I think that's and we can end it there. That really the Bible and the Book of Mormon are really the record of the covenant people. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Those who join the covenant become the covenant people. Sometimes it's listed as the people of Israel, which these are all people of Israel. They're all, but we also become part of that covenant by adoption when we follow Christ, and when we adopt that covenant, or when we accept that covenant, we become that covenant people. So
yeah, and
I think
that's part of why Lehi is able to say, "Oh, how merciful you are," because he recognizes that part of the covenant is it's this chesed we've talked about before, right?
Right. Yeah.
Part of the covenant is that when you mess up, God will still he'll humble you and he'll bring you back to him and he'll accept you back, right? And so even when you're seeing the punishments that come, you can recognize them. Well, that's just God trying to get us to come back to him. And you see it as mercy rather than as all sorts of terrible things. And that's a trait we see in Lehi, and we're going to see it in a lot of other people, Captain Moroni and others. It's great stuff. So,
well, that's a nice setup for the environment of the Book of Mormon and where it comes from and why it's important, and as a continuation of the Old Testament, and then particularly the Old Testament, because that's where they're coming from, but bridging that whole covenant people and the covenant extending to all. Even though they're scattered, they're really going out and the borders of Zion. They're spreading out the covenant to other people in other places. So that's a great way to frame the Book of Mormon. We're going to get into the rest of this reading. We'll talk about Nephi particularly, and who he is, and how he conquers some of his own things with Laban and so forth. But I think that let's leave it there with the setting of the covenant people expanding out, and while being scattered, they're still expanding and spreading that covenant to new places.
amen. Thank you.
All right.
I am so excited to announce that we are launching our website. With fingers crossed, we plan on it being live by Tuesday morning. That's Tuesday, January 9th. It should be live, and we have a bunch of stuff on there we're going to keep adding, and we'll always keep adding. And we're looking for other contributors as well, but we're going to have stuff on there. For myself, there'll be a special, what we call a Mulestein Masterclass. I'll do those every now and then. Eventually, I'll do like whole classes. Like I want like a 30 lesson on the Old Testament, or maybe 45 lessons or something on the Old Testament at some point. We're going to have interfaith roundtable discussions. But I'm doing a master class right now that will be available on Jerusalem at the time of Lehi, and the route that Lehi probably took as he left Jerusalem, and just some things that will help the beginning of the Book of Mormon make sense to you. I've spent a lot of time putting that together, and we're going to have handouts that I give to my Book of Mormon classes. I'll eventually have books that are out of print that are available there, and we have some other people doing things for mental health and interfaith, and we're even going to have some art things and some business things. So all sorts of things available for a very small subscription fee to keep the website running. So this is something that I hope will be exciting for you. We're going to have special episodes of the podcast and probably some early releases for those who are hoping to get it even earlier for preparation for their seminary classes or something. Anyway, we're trying to put all sorts of things on this. So it's called Enlighten Edge EDU. So you can go to patreon.com. So that's Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com, then do / Enlighten Edge EDU, all one word. So patreon.com / Enlighten Edge EDU. And you'll be able to get access to all of these great things that we're trying to put on this website. I hope it becomes something that's really useful for you. We want this to be edifying educational experiences. We'll eventually have tours and all sorts of other things on there. And it's going live. We're making this happen. Thanks to all of those who are helping us to make it happen. There are a lot of people who have been behind the scenes, especially our producer, BJ. But so many people. Yeah, and we hope you'll join us next week. We're going to have Phil Allred on again. He's always popular. Everyone loves him when he's on again. And actually, we're having Noel Reynolds for 2 weeks in a row. Noel's going to talk about some elements of 1 Nephi 10 that he thinks set the theme for all of 1st and 2nd Nephi. So these are two great scholars, great teachers. So join us next week. You're going to love it.
Fantastic. Well, we'll see you next time. Thanks, Kerry.
Thank you.